Hi, my name is Robbie Grammer, and I'm the National Security Reporter at Foreign Policy Magazine. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm really excited about this event that we have today. I'm excited to convene some top-tier experts on African issues for important and enlightening discussion on the BRICS Summit, the upcoming AGOA Forum, the UN General Assembly, of a trifecta of really important diplomatic events that I think showcases how important the African continent has become in the 21st century. And with me here for this discussion, we have Dr. Zainab Usman of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We have Landry Signe with the Brookings Institution, Oge Onbogu with the Wilson Center, and Ambassador Ramayad here with the Atlantic Council. We've got a lot to cover and just an hour to do it, so I'd love to dive right in. I'd love to start with the BRICS Summit. Dr. Usman, can you tell me what you're tracking with this upcoming summit? You know, this is a major summit constituting about a quarter of the world's GDP, 40% of the world's population, with some of the world's top emerging economies, and it seems to have gotten a lot more attention than BRICS summits in the past. Why do you think that is?
Thank you very much for having me here, Atlantic Council. The BRICS Summit is definitely happening at a time of very profound geopolitical shifts, but also structural changes in the global economy. The relationship between the world's two largest economies, the United States and China, is really not what it was even a decade ago. There's the tension between Russia and Europe, and really this kind of Russia-Western standoff, in a sense, over the war in Ukraine. These two countries, China and Russia, are founding members of BRICS. So the fact that they're coming together with other countries, middle-income economies, is, of course, very, very profound. And then this is happening in South Africa, the summit. This is perhaps the first BRICS summit happening in person after the pandemic. So all of these kind of coalesce to make it a very, very interesting, newsworthy event. And indeed, there are a number of key things that I'm tracking on that front. The first is, of course, discussions or ideas around expanding the membership of BRICS. For the first time, we've seen an unprecedented interest by over 40 countries to join this group that I think a lot of other analysts have really dismissed as just, you know, a grouping of countries that have nothing in common. From Africa to the Middle East, or West Asia, as some people like to call it, to Asia proper, to Latin America, over 23 countries have formally indicated their interest to join. So I'm definitely interested in seeing what BRICS itself is going to come up with in terms of criteria for allowing new members to join. I think we're going to get a sense of that by tomorrow when the summit ends. The second thing I'm tracking is with respect to ideas about reducing the role of the dollar in cross-border transactions. Now, a lot of the media commentary has wrongly, in my view, focused on the idea that the BRICS are going to put forward one single currency as an alternative to the dollar. Certainly, those ideas have been thought of. In particular, Lula da Silva has floated that idea. But I think that is really fringe to the key issue, which is that they are really thinking about systems and mechanisms for allowing the greater use of their national currencies in trade relations, in cross-border transactions. And in fact, the new development bank, which is the multilateral development bank based in Shanghai, is going to play a key role on that front. So just a few days ago, Dilma Rousseff, the head of the new development bank, mentioned that they are floating rand-denominated and rupee-denominated bonds. So that they're going to play a key role in accelerating the use of member state currencies and increasing the convertibility of those currencies. So those are two key things, among other things that I'm tracking with respect to the BRICS Summit.
Landry, I wanted to turn to you a bit about this, fellow economist. I mean, the dollar is obviously king. Can it stay that way? And is there any way that these ideas coming out of the BRICS could at some point supplant the dollar, or is that just fantasy given the hard economic realities these days?
Thank you very much for having me. So let me perhaps first react on the broader implication of the BRICS for Africa. So it is happening at a time where the African continental free trade area is accelerating its implementation, given the number of countries which have signed, the number of countries which have ratified the agreement. And when we think about the combined consumer and business spending by 2030, which will exceed $6.7 trillion US, and by 2050 will exceed $16 trillion US. So I want to highlight a couple of points. So the first one, why is the BRIC so important in Africa, or from an African perspective? It offers a partnership with an egalitarian perspective. I think that is a dimension which Africans leaders are valuing extensively, but also with no conditionalities. As we know, whether we speak about many of the Western partners or the multilateral development institutions, so conditionalities are key dimensions of way of working. So that is different with the BRICS. And another key dimension is that he also focuses on really accelerating trade and investment, and less perhaps on aid. So this is another key dimension. As a matter of fact, many of the BRICS nations, including especially China, is the first partner when we speak about trade in Africa, or when we speak about investment in terms of infrastructure, amount order. So really, it has a value proposition for the continent. That's one dimension. The second dimension, countries from the BRICS also have a clear interest when they engage with Africa. For example, when we speak about natural resources, the implication of China or other countries, including Russia, but particularly of China in Angola, in Sudan or South Sudan, amount order in Nigeria. But we also speak about, in particular, the implication of China in DRC for critical minerals, amount order. So it's really important to take those dimensions into consideration, let alone agriculture, also new market, access to new markets. So yes, the BRICS this year is really happening at a time where Africa is at the forefront of many conversations, whether in terms of opportunities, but also in terms of geopolitical challenges, in terms of multiplication of military coup and other dimensions, and in terms of geopolitical competition between the East and the West, among others. An additional dimension, something which is quite intriguing, despite the enthusiasm for the BRICS, when you look at Afrobarometer survey, African citizens, per the recent survey, African citizens prefer the American model of development over the Chinese one. And the other models come very far behind. So this shows that despite that enthusiasm, you have a kind of a dichotomy in terms of perception, in terms of engagement, and it's important to go beyond the leaders to also engage with the citizens. Now coming to the replacement of dollar, this a difference between the policy intention. I think that, of course, this has been, it's not the first time that it is at the forefront of conversations, but I think the dollar will not be replaced tomorrow, despite the enthusiasm that many citizens or many leaders have for alternative ways of payment. So the dollar remains central, the dollar remains also the most trusted currency, including for the leaders who are promoting otherwise from a country perspective, but from an individual perspective. So it makes a difference. So that's why I think the glorious hours of the dollars are not part of the past. They are still, the conversation will continue. It will be a little bit weakened, but it will remain central in global affairs.
So the dollar's here to stay, it sounds like. Okay, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, one of the themes underlying this BRICS Summit is this era of geopolitical competition. And it seems from the outside like African countries are being put in a position where they're almost forced to choose between China, the United States, or Russia. It seems like a really difficult or awkward diplomatic position. I'm wondering if you're seeing that play out at the current BRICS Summit and how that might play out on the African continent. I mean, if there are any drawbacks or if there are any silver linings here where even if it's in the context of geopolitical competition, these larger powers are paying a lot more attention to these countries.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that question, and really appreciate the contributions already from my colleagues here. I think to that point, I want to pick up from where Landry left off when he spoke about what it means for the citizens. And I think for me, as I track the BRICS Summit happening this week, and I look at the conversations that have been happening leading up to the summit, you know, it's pretty unhelpful to look at it as a BRICS versus the rest of the world. Because at the end of the day, beyond the rhetoric and the big languages and the big words that are used, everyday Africans want to know what the recommendations coming out from these discussions, the outcomes coming out from these conversations, how do they impact the lives of everyday people? How do they change the economic situations or social situations that people currently find themselves in? So it is clear that the geopolitical landscape, the dynamics are changing, that there are greater conversations now about the architecture of global governance. And yes, those will play out in the conversations this week. But increasingly, citizens are asking, what does this mean for them, especially Africans? What does this conversation, what does an expansion of BRICS look like for the representation of African views? Obviously, within BRICS itself, the members of the coalition all have different ideologies on where they stand on certain issues. With an expansion and new membership coming in, what would this look like? How would this represent the view of citizens? So I think for us, as we have this conversation, it's important for us to keep this in mind and not necessarily framing this as a BRICS versus the West or BRICS versus the rest of the world, but really thinking about a platform where a broader coalition, a broader group of emerging economies or countries from the global south, as it were, as they say, are able to have a more equitable representation of their views in the global conversation.
What does an expansion of BRICS look like? Can it be successfully pulled off, or would it be something where if so many disparate countries come together, it sort of dilutes the purpose and the effectiveness of such an institution?
Thank you, Robbie, for the great question. But first, I would like to thank you for accepting to, on behalf of Foreign Policy, to moderate this conversation. And I would like to thank my friends and colleagues here, Brookings, Wilson, Carnegie, and we thank of Joseph from USIP, who could not join today, for accepting to do this conversation at the Council. I cannot remove anything of what they just said. And to answer your question, I wouldn't like to play the bad cop's role, but just jump into what Ogie just said right now. I was wondering, and it will answer your question, what does BRICS mean? What is Africa's role in this platform? Because, of course, it's pretty impressive. You mentioned the numbers, 40% of the population, you know, it's growing in terms of economy and business and trade. Major voices are there in South Africa today, including Xi Jinping, the president of China, who never travels, and who showed up there, and Vladimir Putin, despite this international arrest warrant, is virtually there, and they have all these big ambitions around unseating the dollar. Fine, but Africa's role is pretty limited here. It's just South Africa, which is the smallest country, and I'm not surprised to see today President Ramaphosa calling his African colleagues to join in order to have a better representation of Africa in this platform. I don't see South Africa or India or other African countries to be dragged into some new Cold War. We know that South Africa and many African countries care about their trade relations with the US, for example. And we will see that at the renewal of the US-Africa trade agreement, AGOA, very soon. And the war in Ukraine, do they want to be dragged into the war in Ukraine too through this strong presence of the president of Russia? All these questions are very, very important. And I don't know how many countries are knocking at the door, at the BRICS door, 14, 19. A few African countries are, like Nigeria or Algeria, but you have also Iran and authoritarian regimes. And how will they be included in this platform? So I think for Africans, it's a moment of truth. And what is important for them, or what is on the line, is to carry their own voice in this new international order, and not to be dragged into some Cold War or war in Ukraine or any other war of this kind, or trade war that would include China and the US. So what Africans think and want for themselves beyond these big powers, that is a question they need to answer today. But to do that, they need spokespersons. I mean, among these regional powers from South Africa to Nigeria, who will carry and bring this Pan-African narrative, that Pan-African message to the rest of the world. That is absolutely key if Africans want to do things beyond their divisions or their differences, and to bring more consistency and maybe something bigger than the BRICS, and bigger than this competition.
I want to get back to some of the things you said, but really quick, Zainab, I did want to ask about this idea of a BRICS currency, because it sounds like a fringe idea, but I'm wondering, is there any way that it could be pulled off, even if it won't be this year, or is that just too pie in the sky an idea to be economically feasible?
To answer your question directly, and I'll explain the context for my response, I think it's too pie in the sky right now, and there is indeed a realization from among the BRICS member countries, but also from key economists and decision makers, even in the New Development Bank, that this is really not feasible in the immediate term. You know, the idea of a common currency, look at even the euro, for example. You know, you have different economies moving at different speeds. You would have to have some kind of convergence around monetary policies. It just starts to get really complicated and really messy. And I really want to go back to a point that I made earlier and emphasize on it, because I worry that we are also getting distracted as analysts by focusing so much on this idea of a common currency that it distracts us from real developments on the ground that are actually going to be more momentous and more profound than the idea of rolling out a common currency, which is that the idea of using BRICS member currencies in cross-border trade and other transactions. That is going to be very, very impactful. And I want to pick up on a point that Landry made earlier about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. One of the key elements of its implementation is actually around enhancing the convertibility of local currencies in Africa, for African countries to be able to trade with one another without using third-party currencies, either the US dollar or the euro. So think about it, a trader in Nigeria trying to sell their goods to the neighboring country, Benin Republic. Right now, they need a third-party currency. It just brings up all sorts of complications. But then the Africa Continental Free Trade Area has a Pan-African payment settlement system that they unveiled last year, which is precisely meant to allow that convertibility. And a number of other countries, not just in Africa, but also around the world, are trying to do that. So what the BRICS are trying to achieve is actually around that, enhancing that convertibility of local currencies. But very, very importantly here, and I want to bring in the China factor, China also has an interest in increasing the use of the yuan in its trade relationships with the BRICS, but also Africa, but also other parts of the world. As you know, China is now the largest trade partner for a lot of countries, including in Africa. So I worry that if we keep focusing on the BRICS currency, which is not happening anytime soon, they're not really doing much on that front. We ignore all of these very profound shifts that are happening. And that will perhaps be, they're not going to replace the dollar, but they are going to provide mechanisms for countries to not use the dollar in transactions, but also in lending, right? The new development bank right now floating bonds denominated in the Indian rupee, in the South African rand, and they've made it very clear that they want to do more lending in other currencies. Those are the kinds of things that will chip away at the dollar. They're not going to replace it, but they will chip away at it, and these are trends that I think we need to pay attention to.
Andre, it looks like you're nodding along here. I'd love to hear your perspective on whether these trends can actually chip away at the dollar's dominance before we move on.
I think I agree with what Zeynep had said. So they will not replace the dollar. So there will be an additional method of payment. And if I push a little bit further, I will compare it with ECOWAS and ECAS, so the countries in Francophone Africa which are using the CFA franc. They also trade easily in euro and in dollars. So I think they will add additional tools for payment instead of substituting. And I bring this back again to the question of trust, the question of availability. When you engage with business leader, the reason why alternative methods of payment are important, so they reduce the impact or the external control of the currency on the transaction which are made. So for many times when they're trying to, entrepreneurs are trying to acquire products, they cannot always do that because of the availability of the currency and of the exchange at the appropriate exchange rate. So that's one of the dimensions. Now, we should not overlook also the fact that currencies are tools for economic development. They are tools to control or absorb shocks. The ability of countries to control their own, the parity in case in the CFA zone, for example. One of the reasons why numerous of the citizens or players have mobilized sometimes against the CFA franc is because it doesn't allow individual members or individual countries to actually control their monetary policies and also to better manage their economic context, especially in case of crisis, and to absorb shocks in the way that they will prefer. So for all these reasons, I think that yes, as Zeynep mentioned, we will have additional tools which are extremely important, especially in the context of Africa. But again, I think the dollar is there to stay despite that enthusiasm because the new currencies will not be effective tomorrow.
I want to move on from the BRICS Summit in a moment, but first, Rama, Oge, you were both talking about the need to avoid getting sucked into this great power competition type dynamic for these countries, the importance of a Pan-African voice to speak for the whole continent. I mean, do you think that will happen? Because it seems like the way things are going in Washington, in Beijing, there's all of this foreign policy seems to be fixated on this era of great power competition. And it just seems like a lot of the rest of the world could be dragged into it unwillingly. I mean, do you see a risk of that at this ongoing BRICS Summit? I mean, how do you think that will play out? And do you think that there is going to be a Pan-African voice emerging saying, no, let's not fall back into our old ways here?
Okay, you will go.
Sure, I believe that the risks are certainly there for folks who want to drive this sort of conversation. As I mentioned, within BRICS itself, there are individual countries within BRICS that have different ideologies on where things stand and how to get things done, be it Russia, be it China. They all have their different ideologies. So there is a danger of getting sucked into that. But as I tracked the conversations leading into this summit, I think one good thing there is that just as there's a danger, there is a realization as well by the African countries that they do not want to get sucked in to this agenda, that they want to actually see something tangible coming out from these conversations. So, and that's why I say that even for those of us analysts, the international community, the way we frame these conversations really matter. Because when we frame the conversations as, this is an agenda that will just be a session where it will be a discussion on how do we challenge the West, it's not helpful. It distracts us from some of the key conversations that could be happening. I think it's important that BRICS isn't looked at or seen as an alternative to the G7 or G20 or the UN, but actually seen as an additional platform where a broader coalition of countries, where a larger group of countries can have their voices represented. So as you said, and just to respond to your question, is there a danger? Yes. But I am consoled with the fact that there is a realization as well that folks do not want to get sucked into that agenda.
Yeah, agreed. Times have changed. We are not in the 60s or the 70s. Africa has changed a lot too. There is a new generation of people, a growing middle class, a youth that is empowered by the social media. They express themselves and their views. A new generation of business leaders. You see the rates everywhere. Africa is the home of the highest rate of entrepreneurship. It means something. So I think the path of these people, these Africans, is not about ideology like before. I think the crucial need for Africans right now, and we'll see if the BRICS and these alternative systems answer that question. They need to do business. They need to reach the development goals. 200 billion per year are needed in Africa to finance and fund education, health, and etc. And I really think that it can be an opportunity. This moment is a turning point, a crossroads for the world, including for Africa. And it's not only a crisis, it's also an open window to a new world where we can try to better answer African needs. And it's not about assistance, it's not about being used in some international geopolitical game. It's about not missing these key moments when we can lift the continent at a higher level of development. And it goes through more business, and maybe more space for African voices in international bodies. So if you have the BRICS today doing all this stuff, it's maybe because we missed the opportunity to reform the international bodies. G20, it was G7, G20, G30, the Security Council of the UN. We have been talking about the reforms for decades now. The Bretton Woods system, we have been talking for reforms of Bretton Woods for decades now. And now it's coming. Maybe it's coming. Because these questions, these conversations are on the table. And they can be maybe these reform or these new international bodies that will come out from this conversation will be an alternative to the BRICS in the next years. And that's why it's so important to succeed these reforms of the World Bank, of the IMF, to include African states and nations in the G20 much more than we did before. And the answer is not in the BRICS hands or in Chinese hands, but the answer is in Washington. The answer is in Paris. The answer is in Brussels, because they are key in this geopolitical order. And they have the tools to make the difference and trigger changes So it's up to them to do that. Otherwise, the BRICS are here to remind everybody that there's also an alternative somewhere. And that is not what we want here, because that is only competition. And in that competition, where are Africans? And we come back to our previous question.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add to what Rama mentioned about the kind of greater geopolitical context, and that the BRICS now is getting a lot of attention. I mean, think about it. Just even 5 years ago, few people were talking about the BRICS. But this time around, there's so much attention because there's something happening. The reality is more countries want to join the grouping, no matter how useless people think the grouping is. 40 countries wanting to join is an indication of something, that those countries feel that the current global governance arrangements are just really at odds with the reality of, one, the global economy, two, global demographics. You think about the UN Security Council with its 5 permanent members. What is the criteria for inclusion of those 5 members? If it's the size of their respective economies, India today has the 5th largest economy in the world. Why is it not on the UN Security Council permanent membership? It is the world's most populous country. It's not there, right? So, there's India, Indonesia, all of these countries that and then in particular African countries that feel current global governance institutions as they are constituted reflect the realities of the immediate post-World War II era. So there's definitely an impetus to really think about governance arrangements and how to ensure that there is more inclusion. So it's just something that I thought to highlight.
Yeah, that's a good segue. I said I wanted to move on from BRICS, but we got a great question from one of our audience members who was focused on the eye of BRICS. The question for anyone here is, what do African countries want out of India here? We've talked a lot about Russia and China, but what do they want out of India here, particularly at the summit going forward?
So I think one of the particularities of India is the fact that it combines both economic prosperity and democratic development. So it shows that you can achieve both simultaneously by being a large country. So that is one of the dimensions. When we also speak about information and communication technology, the 4th industrial revolution, India has also shown the way, especially in working very closely with many other global partners in leveraging human capital to advance industrial development, among others. I know you wanted to shift away from the question of global power and geopolitics, but let me bring it back with your authorization, of course.
Absolutely.
When we speak about the drivers of foreign policy, especially for great power, we look at 4 key variables: power, peace, prosperity, and principle. And foreign policy decision-making are often a trade-off between those. To what extent do we have a convergence between peace, power, between achieving the goals related to peace, power, prosperity, or principles? And as Rama was mentioning also earlier, it is really important, and the reason why we have an heterogeneous level of position, if I can mention. So African countries are not converging. So whether it's when you speak about voting at the United Nations, when it comes to sanction to Russia or to many other questions, it's heterogeneous because I want to bring back, because when we speak about Africa, we know that this is 54 countries, but we often tend to also overlook that in the nuances that we bring. Those individual countries have different considerations in terms of prosperity, in terms of economic interest, in terms of trade relation, in terms of preference toward either China or Russia. So they have their own dynamics. For example, what happened in Niger, one of the reason which was used to justify the coup also was the proximity of the ousted president with some partner with the French people, for example, the French government or the West in general. So I want to bring that dimension because although we aspire and the continent also show numerous indicators of convergence, there are also clear differences. And South Africa was very clear. They clearly mentioned their first and foremost goal in engaging with the BRICS is to advance South African interest, which could be power, peace, prosperity, or principle, and of course also to advance African interests. But South Africa interests come first. So that is a dimension that I want to bring, and that is why some countries on the continent will be more aligned with some global partners than others. It's not just a question of principle. I think it's a trade-off. It's a convergence between the principle they may have eventually, but most importantly, the economic prosperity consideration and also the peace and power considerations.
You mentioned Niger. I want to get to that in a bit, but first I wanted to bring up the upcoming AGOA Forum, the U.S.-Africa Free Trade Initiative. South Africa is in a very diplomatically awkward position right now, given the messages coming out of Washington, the anger from some in Congress and the White House over its historic relationship with Russia. Rama, maybe you could speak to this. There are lawmakers threatening to cut off South Africa from AGOA. And there is this obviously important historical relationship South Africa has with Russia, but it's also facing these pressures from the U.S. How is this AGOA summit going to play out? Because it seems like there's some trouble in the works.
Yeah, South Africa is very concerned about this U.S. anger, given the fact that they have been trying these past weeks to reconnect with the U.S. and explain their position that is supposed to be a neutral position, and they would like to insist on why they have promoted this neutral position, given the historic ties with the Soviet Union, and it matters in a country like South Africa and in Africa too, because when people fight for their freedom, they are grateful for their partners to have been there at a very important moment of their destiny. So I think we should just recognize that as a key element of the African positions. For the rest, U.S. have not seen that South African neutrality these past weeks, and that's why they are asking explanations. But for South Africa, the U.S. matter in their strategy, and AGOA is critically important for South Africa, and that's what President Ramaphosa told today at the BRICS Summit, reminding everybody that they care about the diversity of their partnerships from the U.S. to Russia, and they wouldn't like to give up this balance, and I really think that South Africa will remain stuck with that firm position between the two global powers. On the other side, I would add that South Africa has much more to do in Africa than beyond, because South Africa is an African country, right? And I mean, most of the countries on this continent have fought for South Africa when they fought for their liberty, and today many African countries have this impression that South Africa is more interested in playing some role in that global stage than exactly what you said, playing a role on the continent, and a leading role, and that leading role was expected decades ago, and it did not happen. And now Africans are turning to Nigeria. Nigeria, which is the first population in the most populous country in Africa, the first economy before South Africa now, and now they have this ECOWAS chairmanship around Niger, where they try to champion democracy, human rights, and everything. And they are trying to test this idea of restoring democracy with an army, a regional army, That's interesting for Africans and for the rest of the world. And that positions Nigeria in a leading role. And now, I don't know what they will do or how they can build from that, but a Pan-African narrative, because now we are talking about reforming, the G20, the international bodies, etc. And Africans cannot advance a diverse agenda on those reforms, on those platforms. They need to speak, even if they are 55 or 54, they need to speak with one voice on this and to get more consistency on the international stage, because it's the only way to avoid this Cold War thing, And this balance between South Africa and Nigeria is interesting. And I think that South Africa is aware, and that's why they are doing their best these days to keep the balance between Russia and the US.
Okay, Niger has come up a few times now, and I wanted to talk a bit on the democracy and governance angle here. I mean, we've seen coups in Mali, in Chad, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, and now Niger. I mean, this seems like an epidemic of coups in this region. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel here? I mean, what's going on, and how has the international response to this crisis affected the stability of the entire region?
Well, thank you very much for that. Let me actually pick up on some points that Rama made on AGOA first before I go into the question on Niger. And then also pulling back on the BRICS Summit too as well, because as I look at the entire continent and I see all these events happening, the BRICS Summit is happening while the theme for the AU this year is accelerating the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And then hopefully South Africa will be hosting the AGOA Forum in November.
Hopefully, keyword.
And so we see all these conversations happening where with the African Continental Free Trade Area, there's that importance on integration and trading within Africa. Then there's also the importance of trading outside of Africa and forming partnerships and building and deepening the relationships that different countries have. And I love the point that you made about the fact that every country, individual countries on the continent, all have their own agendas and aspirations. And sometimes when we talk about Africa, we tend to lump everything together. Yes, we have the African Union, and it's important to have that voice that presents a collective voice for the continent. But it's also important to keep in mind that different countries have their own agenda and foreign policy agendas as well. And so that brings me to the question on Niger and what we see happening across West Africa. I think we see a change that has, and this is not something that is recent. This has been happening for some time. And I think it's important for the international community and for the regional, for the elected officials within the region too as well, within the continent, to start reading the room, to understand that citizen voices matter. Very often when we talk about foreign policy or we make foreign policy prescriptions, we tend to divorce them from things that are happening on the domestic front. And increasingly, as we've seen the coups across the different states, across the different countries in West Africa, we see that a lot of them have been informed by what citizens are feeling, by what is happening at the local level, what the people are feeling, what the people are experiencing. And so it's important that as we read the room, as we understand the situation, we take that into consideration. Public opinion matters. If citizens across the region are saying, we prefer democratic systems of government to any form of government, but on the same vein, public opinion data is also showing us that while the demand for democracy or effective governance or responsive governance, there's a high demand for responsive governance. On the other side, it's showing us that the supply is low.
Ram, I wanted to turn back to Zainab and Andre in a second, but first I'm wondering, because the United States and France have really invested a lot into their security relationships in these governments in the Sahel that are very coup-prone, I mean, do you get the sense that there's any sort of introspection going on in Paris and Washington now about their approaches to the Sahel region, that there might need to be a total sea change in how they see this and start focusing more on governance and what citizens feel as opposed to security first? Or do you think we're just going to keep seeing more of the same?
In Washington, obviously, because we see like a bold geopolitical move in the Sahel right now, maybe at the expense of Paris. That's the question people are asking in Paris. It's not African action, it's the US in action in Niamey. But for what, that's the question. And with whom, that's another question. And I think that there is some existential crisis in the French policy to Africa right now, after decades of influence in the Sahel region. I think the long presence of the French army in the region, without any tangible outcomes in the fight against jihadism, is a challenge. The first challenge the French face right now in the region. The second one is, I told earlier that Africans have changed and they don't accept double standards anymore or cheap standards. And it's very important to step up, to do better. And I think that the change of the paradigm in this relationship with African nations is very important. Maybe a reset of the relationship. Barkhane left, Tabuka left, and now you have these questions around the defense bases on the continent. It's important. The franc CFA currency, it's important too. The question of immigrants and migrations, it's also important in the relationship. All these conversations did not happen, candidly and openly. And the problem is, in the civil societies, it's a higher demand. It's very important. So I think that's what's going on right now. And then the US, it's a traditional ally of France in Africa, but we feel that they try to decouple their strategy from France. But what is important to me here is what do Africans want, and where the ECOWAS initiative will go, because it will have a lot of impact on the rest of the continent, I think.
I did want to go briefly back to AGOA here. Obviously AGOA, it's about free trade, it's about economics. How can policymakers incorporate this crisis of democracy and governance into these conversations and these really important diplomatic events coming up?
So I'm going to address that, but let me try to pick up on a few things mentioned here. Specifically with respect to Niger and the Sahel, I do think what is going on in that sub-region points to, of course, serious governance challenges within those countries that they need to address. You go to parts of Niger, especially up north, there's no state presence there. There's no hospital, there's no police station, there's no court, nothing that tells you that there's government presence. And that is the case indeed with quite a number of countries there. So there are things that they need to do. At the same time, I think it points to the fact that the approach to engaging with that part of Africa, and indeed many parts of Africa, by the US, by France, needs to be rethought. It's been overly securitized. There needs to be a focus on the long term, which is how to use US resources, US comparative advantage, whether it's in terms of capital, technology, educational institutions to give opportunities to people in those regions, to create jobs, to invest in whether it's manufacturing or new industries or new sectors of the economy. That in the long term is what is going to help address the security challenges in the region. France, I am aware of this, tried to put out a new approach to Africa shortly before the wave of coups. Tried, keyword, tried. Macron made a big deal of saying that France would roll back the security or securitized and militarized approaches to engaging with the sub-region, but also with other parts of Africa. So I think that needs to happen. And we've seen this in the United States, that in the US strategy towards Africa that was unveiled last year, there was really an emphasis of trying to do more around trade and investments, because there are opportunities in Africa. But the truth is also within the context of this geopolitical contest with China. China is making so much headway in Africa, Africa's largest trade partner in aggregate, Chinese investments, financing construction projects, etc. So then this is a good segue into going back to your original question around AGOA. And I think AGOA is going to be crucial here in how the US reimagines its relationship with the continent. But AGOA needs to be thought about slightly differently. The African continent of today is not what it was in the year 2000 when the Trade and Development Act was enacted. Very, very different. Countries like Nigeria, Tanzania, Senegal, etc., have all transitioned to middle income status. So it needs to be thought differently. And when you look at AGOA utilization rates, countries that are kind of the star performance, there are about 5 of them: South Africa, Ethiopia, Lesotho, Madagascar, etc. How about thinking about how to work with other countries on the continent to increase their utilization rates? One. Number 2 is thinking about new sectors. When you attend AGOA events or roundtables, the discussion, I don't want to pick on anyone, it tends to be focused on one particular sector, which is so bizarre to me. There are so many other sectors, like we need to get a bit more creative. So there are things there that need to be thought through. And then I suppose one final point I want to make here is, much as we expect the US, France, and other partners to do more to reimagine their relationship with individual African countries, but also with the continent, I think it is incumbent on African countries too to be more proactive in being very clear about what their interests are. Where is the African position on AGOA? Sure, there are documents in the African Union. If you go and speak to the experts or this director or that commissioner, but these things are not, ordinary citizens don't know. The business associations in a lot of countries don't know what the main African position is on a number of issues. So what is a common Africa position? Not just on AGOA, but engaging with the United States, engaging with France, etc., but also at an individual country level, thinking through how they organize their engagement with countries in the US, advancing specific ideas about specific issues, I think is going to be key. So huge responsibility on individual African countries, but also on the African Union and Pan-African organizations to be more clear and more assertive about what it is that they actually want.
Yeah. Yes, a few points. So the first one, as Olga mentioned, foreign policies begins at home. So I think that is incredibly important to highlight, and I think that's even the title of a book of the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So that's an extremely important point. Another point also that Rama mentioned is, she asked the question, what Africa wants? Per Afrobarometer surveys, Africa wants democracy. They want accountable governance. They want effective governance. But they even prefer accountability and democracy to outperforming in the delivery of public services and good. So those are dimensions which are important. But now, when it comes to the delivery of public services and good, there are numerous dimensions also, as Senate mentioned, for example, jobs are critical, and actions to address poverty, creation of infrastructure, among others. So those are dimensions which are critical for Africa, and I connect that to what is happening in West Africa and Central Africa. A key dimension, democracy is also expected. Many citizens have been, let's say, committed to democracy with the expectation that democracy will deliver critical public services and good to citizens, including security, because security, if we bring things in context, the social contracts imply that in exchange of giving up on some of your fundamental rights, citizens are supposed to be protected by the government and to receive basic services and good. But in many of the countries in the Sahel, so that contract is unclear, let's say, to use better words. So as long as the US or France or other partners do not support governments, democratic governments in particular, to better deliver for public services and good for the citizen, to achieve development, I think we'll still have the challenge of some leaders or military, especially in the security forces, organizing coup and justifying it for the lack of economic or security outcomes. Where in the countries where those coups were organized, they don't have a better, in the contrary, they have a worsening situation in terms of military and security outcomes. And how could the US particularly support democracy in Africa? I released a publication at Brookings identifying 5 levels of accountability. Personal accountability is the first one. How to support the leader who are personally accountable and dedicated to those values, on those democratic values. Peer accountability. At the beginning of the coup in Niger, the military did not necessarily align immediately with the presidential guard. So peer accountability could have worked if the military were better empowered. So to what extent other leaders will correct the anomalies, if I call them anomalies. And then vertical accountability through elections, among other diagonal, horizontal accountability, checks and balance through independent institutions such as the Constitutional Court, among other, or the Parliament. And finally, diagonal accountability, the role of civil society, which also play a watchdog role. So those dimensions are really important because to achieve sustainability in terms of, I mentioned principles. Principles are key component of US foreign policies, and especially the promotion of democratic values. So the US should further invest in those. And let me land now on AGOA. First and foremost, AGOA should be extended or renewed independently if it's in the current form or in an improved form. It is very simple. Most American corporations or businesses, they represent this uncertainty about what the future will be by 2025 is a serious problem because it affects the ability to decide to invest or not. Second, if it could be made continental versus individual, it would be better because Africa want to trade with the US as a continent, and the leaders of the continent were very clear about it. Another dimension also, sanction. When countries are sanctioned, they are not the leader who are suffering, they are the citizens. When countries are also sanctioned, there are other countries which depend on the supply chain who are also paying for it. And I concluded by saying that the other mechanisms to sanction leaders who are misbehaving versus the entire country could be found, and finally invest in industrial development, create value on the continent versus simply exporting raw material. There's a lot to be said, but I know we are short on time, so I will stop there.
We are indeed short on time, and I'm really sorry, but we have to cut the conversation now. We're at our time. Thank you all so much for taking time. It was a really fascinating conversation. I wish we could have had another hour, but thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you.